Hi, I'm Cody Womack, and this was for Government 150. I did my project on the problem of multinational corporations and taxation. Alright, so some background. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act sought many things, one of which was a corporate tax reform. It brought the statutory tax rate that corporations in the highest income bracket pay from 35% to 21%. But due to existing loopholes in the tax system and things like tax credits, the effective tax rate that multinational corporations will pay is likely to be much less. The IRS has been battling with tax avoidance issues for a long time. One of the intended effects behind the TCJA's change to corporate taxes was to combat the issue that some of the world's biggest businesses engage in, tax avoidance by the use of tax havens, or offshore accounts. There are many factors that feed into what makes taxing multinational corporations a problem, and offshore accounts is one of them. Corporate taxes are the third largest source of revenue for the IRS, but in 2016 only accounted for 11% of the U.S. tax total. So one issue is deferral. A more favorable tax rate gives corporations some incentive to bring their offshore assets and earnings back home, and was meant as a means to fight the previous tax system's issues. Deferral is a tax avoidance strategy used by corporations who artificially move profits overseas to a subsidiary they set up, where U.S. tax law previously allowed the corporation to postpone paying taxes on profits that were earned abroad until they were repatriated, or returned to the U.S. for things like dividends and capital investments. This encouraged offshore investing. Another issue is inversion. The TCJA included measures to reduce the offshore profit shifting of multinationals, but the act might also make the revenue loss issue worse. It's been suggested that the federal government's recent switch to a more territorial-based tax system, in which the U.S.-based MNCs don't pay taxes on foreign profits, will incentivize more corporations to invert and continue to profit shift to tax havens. To explain, inversion is when a company moves its headquarters to a country with a lower tax jurisdiction to reduce its burden on income earned, or allows itself to be bought by a foreign company or subsidiary. For tax purposes, the corporation is then treated like a foreign entity. MNCs typically do this by moving to tax havens, or locations where corporate income tax is significantly lower than the U.S., or non-existent. When companies profit shift overseas, many times the operations of an MNC still take place here in the States, with offshore activity just being reported on the books. It's typically used as an accounting trick. A tax system that exempts foreign income earnings for corporations, like ours does now, may not necessarily reduce the usage of tax havens, and could possibly encourage more offshore investing. Though deferral isn't going to be a viable tax dodging tactic used anymore, its underlying effects remain. Multinational corporations will continue to book profits offshore, and rather than worry about having to eventually pay some of those profits back to the U.S., now we'll never have to. Inversion will continue to allow corporations to list themselves as MNCs if the tax benefits from doing so suit them. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act eliminated repatriation, but didn't address the underlying cause of deferral. The impact. A 2017 publication by the Economic Policy Institute reported that while corporate profits have continued to rise, federal infrastructure spending has, comparatively, been at a stable low since the late 1950s, despite the country's population increasing massively. Does this mean corporations should share more of the tax burden, being originally incorporated here in the U.S. and still using our infrastructure services like public roads? On the topic of tax haven abuse by MNCs in general, it was reported that in 2016, 366 of the Fortune 500 multinational corporations were holding nearly $2.6 trillion in offshore profits, among them big players like Apple, Microsoft, Nike, and Google. That's estimated to be $752 billion owed in U.S. taxes, and a 2017 report of offshore tax haven abuse also revealed that $94 to $135 billion is lost in U.S. tax revenue annually due to multinationals' profit shifting. So where does the problem lie? Before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed, there was much talk of corporate tax reform, with many sources citing the rising problem of corporate inversions, offshore banking trickery, and some solutions. Many of those solutions are not possible anymore due to the TCJA's changing of the system in which corporate tax is calculated. The TCJA changed our corporate tax system to a territorial-based system from its previous global tax system, in which profits earned overseas were subject to both domestic and foreign income tax. Critics of this policy noted that the U.S. was one of the few nations that used a global taxing policy for their multinationals, and believed that a shift to a territorial tax system would make American firms more competitive, allow them to bring overseas income back to the U.S. without being taxed, remove the tax disincentive for domestic investment with foreign income, and decrease the influence that tax considerations have on business decisions, among other things. To explain, a territorial system taxes income earned by businesses only within the country's borders, and allowing most of foreign income to be exempt. The benefit of this system supposedly will level the international playing field for multinational businesses and take a step toward a neutral tax system, though other sources have had doubts of these claims. Those against a territorial tax system believe that by exempting foreign income, MNCs will be more encouraged to avoid paying taxes domestically by profit shifting and investing more in foreign subsidiaries. Options. One policy alternative is to repeal the recently adopted tax system. Returning to a global tax system, with the added stipulation that MNCs have their foreign profits taxed in the year that they're earned, not the year they're repatriated, would help bring home some of the $94 to $135 billion in tax revenue back, as compared to the TCJA's efforts to establish tax cuts of $1.46 trillion for MNCs over the course of a decade. Possible unintended effects of this range from an anti-competitive atmosphere for multinational corporations and negative effects on investment and capital formation, resulting in fewer corporations wishing to do business internationally. So the other policy alternative has been suggested before, and now would require a move back to a more global tax-based system to be implemented correctly, perhaps making its point null now. Simply ending the tax loophole deferral would force U.S.-based multinationals to pay the domestic taxes on their foreign income, and would also reduce dependence on tax havens, since there would be no benefit anymore in U.S. corporations setting up dummy subsidiaries. In our previous tax system, this would have been a policy option to consider, but with the shift now to a territorial system, focusing on shutting down this tactic might no longer be a consideration. A shift to a territorial tax system more or less solidified the deferral situation, and that its effects will still be clear with MNCs excluding foreign income operations from their taxes for the foreseeable future. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act included a measure to bring some of the previous offshore profits back, with MNCs to pay a one-time repatriation tax of 8% on illiquid assets and 15.5% on cash equivalents they have held overseas, tax on the estimated $2.6 trillion total. It's been approximated that repatriation tax will equal around $223.1 billion in revenue over the course of 10 years. So a final policy change to the TCJA could be that the MNCs regularly pay these repatriations, really just the foreign income, annually if their foreign incomes are reported over a certain threshold. Alternatively, they could pay an inversion tax in the year they are reincorporated, perhaps to discourage large corporations from attempting to invert still. Thanks for watching.